Hello, welcome back everyone. Sorry for the hiatus. On this show, I'd like to occasionally challenge convention and ideas that strike me as being total nonsense. Not to exercise the contrarian in me, but rather to try and work out what we do and don't know, what does and doesn't work. And I'd like to start with screen time. Avoid screens before bed is one of a bunch of sleep hygiene recommendations that get sung from the trees. And we all know that screen time before bed disrupts sleep. We do all know that, right? Good. Well, that's it for this episode then. Wait a sec. Maybe we should check the evidence first before assuming this trendy narrative is accurate. I've been thinking about this subject a bit in part because I've been writing a colossal review article on how the environment affects sleep. The article went through a round of peer review recently, and nestled among a couple of impressively patronising comments were some genuinely helpful suggestions, including one about screen time and sleep. The gist of it is that perhaps the relationship between screen time and sleep goes both ways. Screen time affects sleep, and sleep affects screen time. Fair enough. I was already on board with that. I just hadn't spelled it out in the article. That nudged me to spend some more time in the last week looking more closely at recent research though, and doing so has updated my thoughts on screen time and sleep. In particular, a terrific article by Serena Borduco, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name Serena, Michael Gradisar and their colleagues has been instrumental in writing my perspective. So at this point I'd like to say a special thanks to the two of them and their co-authors. I've linked the article and another of theirs in the show notes. Since it seems to me that there's lots of noise about screen time and sleep, often from misinformed influencers parroting the opinions of scientists with limited knowledge of the literature, I thought you might also find the subject interesting, particularly if you've heard and subscribed to the usual screen time spiel. So let's get to it. I used to tell people that screen time can disrupt sleep in three primary ways: light exposure before bed, psychologically arousing content, increasing alertness, and perhaps even increasing distress before bed, and loss of attention to time passing, leading to delayed bedtime and sleep onset. I think these individual points all have some merit, but it's an overly simplistic, incomplete perspective. If we start with why I was partially right, then yes, pre-bed light exposure can very modestly affect sleep, but probably only in specific conditions. Some of the early work on this subject did find that reading an iPad before bed meaningfully delays the circadian system and slightly disrupts sleep. The issue with some of these early studies, though, is the effects they found were massively inflated by the study designs, because they'd sensitized people to the effects of screen light by keeping people in very dim conditions in the hours before screen use. And subsequent research with more realistic daytime light exposure has found trivial effects of screen light exposure on sleep. Looking across studies, the change in time taken to fall asleep after pre-bed screen time ranges from about 10 minutes longer to fall asleep to about 4 minutes faster to nod off. And that's including studies with ecologically invalid light exposure before screen time. And while the effects of light surely depend on the specifics, the light emissions of the particular devices, the sensitivity of the individual to light at night, and so on, these small effects are hardly anything to lose sleep over. Next, regarding the effects of the nature of the content on subsequent sleep, if we look across studies again, we find very small effects on sleep once more, with studies ranging from people taking 9 minutes longer to fall asleep after psychologically arousing content, to people falling asleep 5 minutes faster. Likewise, effects on sleep efficiency, the proportion of time that someone's in bed trying to sleep they're actually asleep, and sleep duration are quite modest. And these studies have included a range of screen-based devices and types of content, including TV, video games, and reading. And some studies have yielded the opposite of what you might expect. An entertaining example is a study that compared watching a relatively neutral TV program before sleep to watching an exciting program that ended in a cliffhanger, which found people fell asleep 5 minutes faster after watching the cliffhanger, although they also had slightly lighter sleep and a higher heart rate during sleep. Regarding my third suggestion, loss of attention to time passing leading to later bedtimes and sleep, I think this might be more important than my two other points, at least for some people. Many people do engage in so-called bedtime procrastination, putting off sleep despite nothing external forcing them to. Pre-bed screen time might affect subsequent sleep timing dramatically in people with certain psychological traits, such as low levels of self-restraint, the tendency to become deeply immersed in the screen-based activities, and FOMO about things that are going on around sleep, like online interactions with peers, especially in the case of adolescents. Others, though, will be able to maintain a relatively regular bedtime with no sense of effort. And for these people, screen time is simply a relaxing way to spend time in the evening, getting them through what's known as the wake maintenance zone, which is a period not long before sleep when initiating sleep would be very hard anyway, due to a high drive to stay awake from the circadian system. Now, a key point that myself and others have failed to emphasize is that devices directly disrupt sleep through notifications shortly before and during the sleep period. This is really obvious, but has not been studied well at all. So far, we have several cross-section studies showing that adolescents who keep their phones on and nearby while in bed sleep worse and are more likely to go on to have sleep problems in the months to come than their peers who don't do that. It's intuitive that this could be very disruptive for lots of us, so clearly we need more work on it. Finally, as mentioned, there's a two-way relationship between screen time and sleep, a point that has been largely overlooked in both the scientific literature and in discussions among the general population. When people have poor sleep health, for example, when many of us don't get enough sleep, we become distractible and struggle to pay attention. Some of us also feel more impulsive and less able to exert self-control. And if I'm unscientific for a moment and use myself as an example, I know I'm much more apt to mindlessly check social media on my phone when I haven't slept well. So I can easily see how I'd be more prone to mindlessly looking at screens before sleep too. To the type A characters among us, such scrolling might feel like wasted time. It does to me, frankly. To others, though, it might provide some psychological comfort, distracting from difficult thoughts and emotions, as has been documented among some teenagers. I'm not really sure what I make of this, for I think that we often need to turn towards difficult thoughts and emotions. So it seems plausible that, at least in the long term, some of this distraction time might be better spent trying to address the sources of those difficulties. Now it's my turn to distract you by asking for a minute of your precious screen time. If you find this episode interesting, I'd be so grateful if you could share it with someone you care about, or share it with a large group of people via social media. If you do, please tag me. I'm at Greg Potter PhD. Alternatively, or in addition, if you could leave me an Apple Podcast review, that would really help me grow my audience. Thanks again for tuning in. I do appreciate it. Let's return to the episode. The question is, what do we do with this information to ensure that our use of screen-based devices around sleep is either innocuous or, better yet, beneficial? I'll end with some tentative recommendations. The first of which is to consider all the ways that you could spend your time before bed. You could spend that time reading a book, listening to music, having sex, doing all sorts of things that might be better than using screens. But there are also screen-based activities that could positively affect sleep. For example, if those screens deliver calming breathing exercises or progressive muscle relaxation exercises, or if you're looking at images of nature which have been shown to promote physiological relaxation. Regarding light exposure, I covered this subject comprehensively in the episodes that I did on circadian biology, which I've linked to in the show notes as well. To reiterate, screen light by itself is not a big deal, probably entirely inconsequential if you spend plenty of time in daylight, especially if some of the daylight time is in the first third of your waking day. But you might as well dim the brightness settings on your screens if you can, and use apps that selectively filter short wavelength rich light. And these apps include things like night shift mode on iPhones, night mode on Android phones, and f.lux on computers. Continuing to content, not all content affects sleep equally. It seems reasonable to me to think that TV might be more benign than TV-based video games on average, and TV-based video games might be more benign than VR-based video games. You get the idea. So if you're going to use screens before bed, pay attention to what you're looking at and its content. And I would err on the side of caution and favour content that isn't too psychologically stimulating. For example, sitting in front of your computer and working on a stressful work project immediately before sleep is probably not going to help you sleep well. I tend to liken the screen-based content that we consume to nutrition. Do you want to nourish your mind with stimulating content, or stuff it with junk? Some junk now and then is fine, but you might not want that to be the majority of your information diet. I once heard the celebrated meditation teacher Joseph Goldstein, someone I deeply respect, say something germane to this. He said, and I quote, "What is frequently arising in the mind becomes the inclination of the mind." Something to think about. Regarding screen time timing, you might want to intervene to minimize the likelihood of bedtime procrastination. Some ways that you might do this include disabling autoplay settings on streaming services such as Netflix. You could also consider a screen time cut point. I think 30 minutes before lights off works well and is doable for a lot of people. And then regarding notifications, ideally keep your smartphone in a different room. Or at least if it's in the same room as you while you sleep, keep it on airplane mode if possible. And if you need to be responsive to others, for example, if you're doing on-call work, if you're a caregiver, you could get a so-called dumb phone, something you could only use for calls, so that the people who need to get in touch can call you during the night. And then finally, if you live with your family, get them on board with these recommendations too. If you have a teenage child, for instance, there's evidence that setting bedtimes and technology use rules is good for many of them and their sleep. To end, I want to say thanks again to Serena Borduco, Michael Gradisar, and their colleagues for helping to update my thinking on this subject. It seems likely that some of the other generic sleep hygiene guidelines are much more nuanced than most people currently appreciate. So we need to stay open-minded and keep testing our assumptions before jumping to conclusions about those as well. Take care and sleep well, everybody.